I found it the way you find most betrayals now, scrolling between a takeout order and a meeting link, and there it was. Camille, in a dress so clean it made my kitchen sink look like a crime scene, her smile perfect, a ring that glittered like an accusation. The caption was all light and confetti and a wedding date. That weekend. No invitation. No, we'd love you there. Just a countdown timer and 37 photos of people who apparently mattered more than me. I sat back so hard my chair complained. For a second, the world narrowed to the glow of my phone and the slow, steady sense of being erased. I'm not dramatic about my life choices. I'm the one who shows up. I manage a team that thinks 10 p.m. emails are a lifestyle. I pay my own mortgage. I book my vacations 3 months in advance because I can't be the person who drops everything for drama. That's the works too much line they toss at me when they want distance without feeling guilty. It's a shorthand for, we don't need you unless you're useful. Useful is what I've been for years. When Camille's little cafe imploded, when she quietly texted the number of the bank that wanted money, I wired her $22,000 without asking for receipts. I didn't make a scene. I fixed it. I fixed flat tires, lied to landlords, took phone calls at midnight about petty landlord revenge, baked pies for everyone's birthdays. That ledger of favors is huge. It's in my bank statements and my calendar and the small, exhausted softness around my jaw. So the absence of an invite read less like oversight and more like a deliberate erasure. I called my mother before I called Camille, because that's who you call when you want a simple answer. Patricia's voice was warm and practiced, like a woman who'd rehearsed exonerations in the mirror. "Oh, Lena," she said, with that particular kind of dismissive softness. "Camille assumed you wouldn't make time. You're always working. You know that." It was a shrug you could hear through the phone. That line landed like a hand on my chest. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it was both excuse and verdict. You are too busy to be hurt. You are too busy to be missed. I let the phone rest against my ear while the glamour photos scrolled on. Guests, flowers, someone laughing like an actor in a rom-com. I pictured myself in the corner of the reception, a non-entity with a wallet. The sting wasn't just about being left out of a party. It was about every small erasure that had added up until the ledger of my life was only balances owed to everyone else. I told myself I wouldn't let it be a thing. I told myself maybe there'd been a clerical error, a misclick, a storm of last-minute plans. But more honest was the small, fierce pulse in my chest that wanted to do something simple and human, to mark that absence as unacceptable. The phone's screen reflected my face, stiff, tired, fed up. And I realized the thing I'd been practicing for years, the habit of being the responsible one, was starting to feel less like virtue and more like a trap. I didn't post a declaration or throw a symbolic match, just tiny, quiet clicks. One by one, I unfollowed Patricia, Robert, Camille, and everyone in the family group chat. No drama, no announcement. It felt like closing a window in a house that had always smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. Practical, private, necessary. It surprised me that the little rupture felt heavy. Social media isn't the real line, it's the visible line. Clicking unfollow was a promise to myself. I would stop being the default scaffolding for their lives. Boundaries have always been something I practiced in spreadsheets and calendar blocks, not in human relationships. This was new. It both terrified and relieved me. I went to see my parents because answers are easier in person, and because a phone call had felt like a rehearsal. Their kitchen had the same curtains I remembered from childhood, floral and slightly faded, forcing the present to look like the past. Robert was stirring coffee like he could unsee things with motion. Patricia's smile was the practiced one, the one that smoothed over guilt like icing on a cake. "Why didn't you come?" I asked without preamble. The words landed like a dropped plate. I wanted simple. Invitation, mistake, apology. I didn't get any of those. Patricia tilted her head, the soft armor of someone who never wants to make you feel bad for making a decision on behalf of someone else. "Damon didn't want you there," she said. "He said you don't care about family." It was a sentence that should have been a comma and instead felt like a period placed on top of my chest. I laughed, a short surprise sound, and then my laugh folded into something colder. Damon who? I said. The man who once showed up to my niece's recital in a suit that still had the tags on it? The man who can't order food without criticizing the menu. Robert's eyes flicked away. You don't have to. No, I cut him off. Tell me what Damon thinks. I wanted the whole smallness of it, everything that allowed them to decide for me. Patricia's voice softened into the same tired cadence she used when she wanted to avoid a fight. He feels like you're distant, that you don't prioritize family because you work. Camille agreed. It was awkward. The claim was absurd on its face and dangerous in its implication. Work had become the weapon they used to justify not making space for me. The shorthand for we didn't bother, and a way to avoid feeling mean. When it came from Damon, Camille's soon-to-be husband, it read like a transfer of power. I wasn't just uninvited. I'd been judged unfit to attend by someone whose opinion mattered more to them than the sister who wired $22,000 to fix a failed cafe and did it without drama. You're basing this on what exactly? I asked. My voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, the way a blade makes a clean line. Patricia shifted, a small animal in domestic clothing. He said you're harsh, that you'll make everyone uncomfortable, that you only come to fix things and then you leave. And that's a bad thing, I pressed. Fixing things is the thing I do. It's why Camille could open a cafe. It's why the landlord called you MacGyver every time the sink leaked. I said it with a hint of humor because humor is how I disarmed my own anger. The kitchen looked smaller with each sentence. Robert cleared his throat. Damon's sensitive. He fears being judged. Camille wants the wedding to be about them. Being judged, I repeated, thinking about what that meant in someone who was cheating and later would slap his wife on their wedding day. So you threw me away to make his insecurity more comfortable. Patricia blinked, hurt and offended in the same breath. It wasn't like that. Wasn't like that, I echoed, tasting the phrase like something wrapped in cellophane. Right. You left me off a guest list because my existence made the groom uncomfortable. You let someone else define whether I belong. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The house went quiet because the problem required no volume, just the steady, brutal light of clarity. I saw the years unspool. Birthday pies baked, because I'd be there. Last-minute calls where I'd hush arguments and move furniture and make things whole again. I saw how each favor had been quietly cashed in for companionship I wasn't being allowed to have when it finally mattered. When I left, I didn't slam the door. Boundaries aren't about theatrics. They're about the small, indifferent actions that accumulate into a new normal. I walked back to my car feeling both lighter and fiercer. The ledger in my head was no longer a list of IOUs I intended to clear. It was now evidence. If I'd been the family's safety net, I wasn't going to be the invisible one holding them all up anymore. That night, I sat with a quiet decision. If someone else was going to tell my story for me, I would start telling it myself. Talia's message popped up like a splinter. I didn't want to pull it first. A thumbnail, then 3 more, then a text that said, bluntly, "You should see this." She'd been at a bar an hour away. She does freelance photography and knows how to angle a shot. And the photos were the sort that make you want to scrub your eyes. Damon with his arm around a woman who was not Camille, laughing like he'd forgotten he was engaged. One picture showed his coat draped over her chair. Another caught them leaning in, phone flash catching a cheekbone. There was even a timestamp. Talia added a last, courteous note. "Saw this last night. Didn't tell you because I wasn't sure. I thought, I didn't want to be the person who messes things up. But you should know." My first instinct was the old reflex I've lived on. Call Camille, sort it out, be the crisis sweeper. We have a choreography to this kind of thing. Me, the blunt instrument of honesty. Camille, the tumbleweed of denial. The rest of the family, reasons. But another voice that's been growing louder in me these last few weeks. Cool, small, efficient. Argued for restraint. Every time I'd pulled someone back from the edge, the gratitude was immediate, and then, inevitably, resented. Helping had a cost. The The currency was shame, and the receipt read, "You owe us for our lives." The last time I saved Camille financially, she looked at the money as a leash and not a lifeline. I could see the scene replayed in my head. Camille furious that I'd make a scene at her wedding, Damon's smug little vindication that he'd asked me to stay away and I'd bucked it, and then the whole thing twisting into another story about how I was the one ruining the romance. I closed the photos and set my phone face down. I told myself I wasn't being cowardly. I told myself truth was its own kind of weapon. If he was cheating, the universe and people with phones would notice. If he wasn't, my interference would have been a theatrical mercy that left everyone resenting me. It felt harsh to decide not to act, but there's a difference between saving someone and rescuing them from consequences they were never going to accept. For once, I wanted natural justice, the kind that arrives with its own receipts. So I sat down to work. I had a deadline and an inbox that required real answers. And deadlines are merciful because they make you inhabit the present rather than the theater of your anger. I opened spreadsheets, typed into a draft email, made a note to call the plumber. The ordinary obligations felt like a tether to a self that wasn't defined by other people's moral emergencies. Then my phone started to vibrate like a bee caught under glass. One notification, then 5, then a chorus. Video, viral, call your mom. I watched the clip because you watch the thing you can't unsee. Damon and Camille stood at the altar. She was in a dress that made her shoulders look younger than she felt, and he looked at her like he'd been caught in a sentence he hadn't finished. Voices rose. Someone shouted something I couldn't parse. And then there was a movement like slow film. Damon's hand, the crack of it against skin, Camille's face breaking in a way that made the whole room intake air at once. The slap landed and the camera kept rolling. The sound was a single, terrible punctuation that made the flowers seem obscene in their cheer. My throat went dry. In the tiny universe of my living room, the world narrowed again to my phone's screen. Comments scrolled like a slow-motion waterfall. Someone had posted a clip of him kissing someone, another clip of him on a message thread denying everything. 100 people were already doing the work I had refused to do. The truth, unhelpfully efficient, had found its own way to daylight. Then the call. Patricia, voice shredded. She was the kind of person who moved from hurt to panic like flipping a switch. She cried about the scandal, about the children, about neighbors seeing the clip. "Lena, come help me. Please come," she wailed, the kind of pleading that lives on the same shelf as late-night forgiveness and frantic damage control. I felt an old reflex, sympathy, responsibility, like a muscle twitch. But underneath it was a steadier thing, memory. I remembered the gloss of that wedding announcement, the absence of an invite, the explanation that I was too busy. I remembered Damon's opinion of me sitting in their mouths as if it mattered more than my history with Camille. I remembered the time I had quietly written checks and rearranged my life for people who would later decide whether I existed. Patricia's cries rose into a chorus and I stayed seated. I didn't answer at first. Then I texted, "You excluded me. You told me I wouldn't make time. I'm not your emergency plan when you erase me." It felt small and exact, like a single clean line drawn on a map. I could have been kinder. There's always room for kindness. But there was no room for being indispensable to people who had made me optional. I watched the notifications slow. The family chat spiraled. People called for statements and apologies and lawyers. Camille's name trended with a mortifying intensity. I felt none of the triumphant glee the internet seems to expect when justice lands. Instead, I felt hollow, a careful, structural sort of grief. Let them deal with their chaos. Let the consequences land where they fall. I had set a boundary, and I learned then that boundaries sometimes look a lot like being alone in the right way. The knock at my door came like a punctuation mark after a sentence I'd already finished reading. It was Robert. Hair tousled, coat buttoned wrong, the kind of man whose shame looked like a bad haircut. He didn't come in with explanations. He came in with a confession that felt like someone upending the furniture in my life to see what would fall out. "I didn't want to bother you like this," he said before I'd even offered him a chair. His voice was small, the voice of a person whose mistakes had finally grown as loud as his pride. Patricia and we signed for a line on the house. We used your name. There's a moment in betrayal where time dilates and all the small, reasonable possibilities flicker and die. I said, explain. He told me, slow and stumbling, how they'd sat across from a banker and signed the forms that weren't theirs to sign. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, he kept saying. We thought it would be temporary. The words had the persuasive shape of someone trying to build a bridge out of not quite truths. He said they'd taken out a home equity line of credit for $195,000, money to cover Camille's debts, to make the down payment on the house she and Damon were buying. He said when payments got tight, they'd kept the withdrawals flowing out of habit and shame until the bank started asking questions. I remember the way my stomach pitched at the numbers. How much? I asked because numbers are where theories harden into consequences. Robert looked at me like he wanted to shrink. We set up automatic payments from your account, he said, $1,100 a month. I did the math because the world had turned into numbers overnight. $1,100 will swell $13,200 a year. Times 4 years equals $52,800. $52,800 drained from my account without my knowledge. The bank had been eating at my equity for years, and I had been paying for their choice like it was a subscription I never signed up for. I felt two things at once, a cold, clean rage, and a surreal, private sorrow. There is a kind of theft that is small and domestic. Signed forms, scribbled initials, the bureaucratic language of consent that can be forged on paper and murder a life in silence. It was worse because it was intimate. They had taken a contract and turned my future into their bail bond. Why didn't you tell me? I said. There's a question that is as much about logistics as it is about moral accounting. Robert's hands trembled. I was ashamed. I thought we could handle it. I thought if it was done quietly, it would be fixed quietly. He looked like a man who'd been squeezing a balloon and finally let go. I called Aunt Livia that night. She arrived with a thermos of coffee and a stare that had been calibrated by decades of family emergencies. Ethan from work, practical, exacting, and annoyingly good at paperwork, came with his laptop and a quiet efficiency that felt like relief. We made a plan because plans are how people stop being gaslit by their own lives. We documented everything. Copies of the HELOC paperwork, bank transfers showing the withdrawals, the auto-pay authorizations routed through my account. Ethan did the thing I do at work. He lined up facts like soldiers and didn't let anyone talk over them. Aunt Livia sat with me and named emotions in the plainest words. Betrayal, theft, cowardice. Naming them made them visible and therefore actionable. When I confronted my parents with the evidence, the scene had none of the theatrics you might imagine. I laid printouts on their kitchen table, the same way you lay out a map for someone who's been lost. Robert stared at the documents as if they were runes. Patricia went pale enough that the floral curtains seemed obscene. Robert's shoulders folded. He offered, with the clumsy decency of a man trying to atone, to sign the house over to me. It was a gesture designed to make a future right by transferring the present's mess into my hands. I won't take your house, I said. The words surprised him. I don't want ownership of your failed choices. I want this to end. I realized in that moment what I'd always feared and what I now wanted more than retribution. Not to be the repository of their shame. I wanted a closure that didn't feel like another mortgage. We negotiated, the three of us, me, them, and the evidence, like people dividing a burned cake. The only practical way forward, the only route that would cover the HELOC and keep the bank from foreclosing, was to sell a little parcel of unused land attached to the property, a side lot no one had thought about in years. It was a compromise, a sale to pay debts rather than a transfer of guilt. Robert and Patricia agreed, hands shaking and faces earnest in that new, awful way people look when consequences finally arrive. The sale covered the remainder of the HELOC after we accounted for what I had already paid. Filing the paperwork felt ridiculous and holy at the same time. Lawyers, signatures, a notary stamp that made the decision undeniable. We filed an affidavit about the forged signature. The bank, suddenly alarmed by proper documentation and an irrefutable paper trail, backed off the foreclosure threat once the debt was addressed and the authority of ownership clarified through the sale proceeds. The legal part was not cinematic. It was forms, phone calls, the kind of procedural justice that hums along with stamps and receipts. There were no dramatic confessions in court, no handcuffs, just an ugly truth made tidy enough for the system to swallow and move on. Afterward, there was a strange, clarifying silence. I walked through my apartment and felt lighter in the way of someone who had finally locked a door that had been left open for years. I'd lost money. My account balance had been hit, and a margin of my future was thinner because of their choices. But I hadn't lost myself. The land sale closed the loop on the bank's threat, and more importantly, closed the loop on their ability to treat me as the family fall guy. When people talk about revenge, they picture fireworks. What I felt was more domestic, the relief of a direct action that aligned consequence with cause. They had used my name as collateral. I used the truth as a corrective. The ledger was balanced not by owning their shame, but by forcing them to reckon with the cost of their choices. That night, I slept like someone who had finally stopped holding their breath. The family text still pinged. Apologies, pleas, complicated little attempts to explain, but they were now messages I could read with distance. I had set terms. I had a map. The rest of the work would be slow and human and messy, but it would be mine to decide whether to engage.